I am 87 years old, and my name is Michael, and I have spent most of my life in business, long enough to watch success repeat itself in familiar patterns, even as industries changed, technologies evolved, and faces came and went. What I learned over those years is that success does not collapse loudly the way people expect it to, and the people who lose everything rarely see it coming, not because they are careless, but because they believe they have finally become safe. I have spent decades around successful people, men and women who built companies, scaled operations, earned serious money, and carried the kind of confidence that comes from winning repeatedly. From the outside, their lives looked solid, permanent, almost untouchable, as if success itself had wrapped them in protection. They were admired, consulted, and trusted, and many of them began to believe that whatever worked once would always work again. What troubled me most was how quietly things began to slip, because there was never a single moment where you could point and say, "This is where it starts." There were no public failures at first, no dramatic collapses, no obvious warnings. There were only small decisions that felt earned, habits that seemed justified by past wins, and a growing sense that caution was no longer necessary. Confidence slowly replaced discipline, and familiarity replaced curiosity. I am not sharing this as someone looking back with bitterness, because business gave me a full life, but it also gave me a front row seat to something few people want to acknowledge, which is that success does not protect you from loss, and in many cases it quietly invites it. I watched strong, intelligent people lose everything without scandal or noise, and by the time anyone noticed, the damage was already done. The ground beneath them had been thinning for years, and they only realized it when there was nothing left to stand on. What most people get wrong about losing everything is that they imagine it happens all at once, as a single bad decision or a sudden crisis that comes out of nowhere, but that was almost never what I witnessed. What I saw again and again was that loss began at the exact moment people stopped being afraid of it, the moment success settled in and became familiar, the moment wins started to feel normal rather than fragile. That was when the real danger quietly entered the room. I watched successful people grow comfortable in ways they never noticed. They stopped questioning assumptions that had once kept them sharp. They stopped double-checking numbers because they trusted their instincts more than the data. They expanded faster than they should have because expansion had worked before, and they borrowed confidence from past victories as if those victories guaranteed future outcomes. Nothing about these choices felt reckless at the time. In fact, they felt logical, earned, even mature. The most dangerous shift I observed was not financial but psychological. Once people started believing they had figured the game out, they became less patient with caution and less tolerant of restraint. Risk began to feel like progress, and stability began to feel like stagnation. They surrounded themselves with people who agreed with them, not because they were arrogant, but because agreement felt efficient and disagreement felt unnecessary. Over time, the voices that once challenged them faded away, and what remained was a room full of confidence with very little resistance. What makes this so difficult to spot is that life continues to look successful on the surface. The offices stay busy, the deals keep coming, the lifestyle remains intact, and from the outside, nothing appears wrong. Even the people living it feel fine, because the early stages of loss are quiet and comfortable. There is no pain yet, no urgency, no reason to stop. And that is why this pattern repeats so reliably, because by the time discomfort finally appears, it no longer arrives as a warning. It arrives as a consequence. Let me tell you about a man I knew for more than 30 years, a man named Daniel, who built one of the most respected mid-sized manufacturing companies in our region, and who did almost everything right for most of his career. Daniel was disciplined in the early years, careful with debt, patient with growth, and relentless about quality. He built his company slowly, turning down opportunities that looked flashy but unstable, and for a long time that caution protected him. By his mid-50s, he was admired not just for his wealth, but for his steadiness. What changed was not his intelligence, and it was not his work ethic. What changed was his relationship with risk once he had proven himself successful. The market shifted, competitors began expanding aggressively, and Daniel felt pressure not from necessity but from comparison. He had the reserves to stay conservative, but he no longer wanted to look conservative. Growth that once required careful study began to feel overdue, and borrowing that once made him uneasy began to feel like a strategic move everyone else was making. He acquired 2 companies within 18 months, both promising rapid scale, both financed more heavily than anything he had done before. The first year looked brilliant. Revenue jumped, his valuation climbed. Industry publications featured him. From the outside, it appeared he had evolved with the times. Inside the company, however, cash flow tightened in ways that were subtle but persistent. Integration costs were higher than projected, margins thinned. Suppliers demanded faster payment as uncertainty grew. None of this collapsed the business overnight. Instead, it drained it slowly. Reserves that once provided safety were used to patch shortfalls. Short-term loans replaced long-term planning. Daniel convinced himself the next quarter would stabilize everything. For 2 years, he managed the tension quietly, not wanting to alarm employees or family. By the time he admitted the strain was structural rather than temporary, the company was overextended and vulnerable. When the downturn finally arrived, it did not create his problem. It revealed it. And what looked like a sudden failure to outsiders had actually been building quietly, decision by decision, long before anyone called it a crisis. What Daniel's story taught me, and what I saw repeated in many different forms over the years, is that financial collapse rarely comes from ignorance, and almost never from a lack of effort. It comes from forgetting the rules that created stability in the first place. The same discipline that builds success is the discipline that must protect it. Yet success has a way of convincing people that those rules are no longer necessary. I watch people abandon margins of safety, not because they didn't understand them, but because safety began to feel inefficient once growth became familiar. The most important lesson I took from watching these quiet losses is that money must always be treated as something that can leave, no matter how much of it you have. Cash reserves are not idle money, they are time, and time is what saves you when plans fail. I saw people treat reserves as wasted potential instead of protection, and once they were gone, every decision became urgent, reactive, and smaller than it should have been. When you are forced to choose between bad options, it is almost always because you removed your ability to wait. I also learned that growth should never be allowed to outrun understanding. Expanding into something you do not fully control or cannot clearly explain to yourself is not progress. It is exposure. Many successful people mistake complexity for sophistication and scale for strength. But complexity hides problems and scale magnifies them. The businesses that survived downturns were not the biggest or the fastest growing, but the ones that knew exactly how they made money and could reduce themselves without breaking. Perhaps the hardest advice to accept is that past success does not reduce future risk. It increases it. Every win raises expectations, commitments, and fixed costs. And unless those are managed deliberately, success itself becomes the weight that pulls you under. The people who lasted were not the ones who chased every opportunity, but the ones who were willing to say no long after they had earned the right to say yes. As I grew older and had more distance from the noise of daily business, I began to see that the quiet loss of wealth was not only about leverage or expansion or poor timing, but about identity. Many successful people slowly tie their sense of self to the size of what they control. And once that happens, scaling back feels like shrinking as a person rather than adjusting as an operator. I watch men who could have stabilized their companies early refuse to slow down because contraction felt like humiliation, and in protecting their image, they quietly sacrifice their stability. The most dangerous financial habit I observed was the inability to step back when the numbers changed. Early in their careers, these same individuals were careful and analytical, yet once they were established, they began trusting momentum more than evidence. Revenue still looked impressive, so they ignored weakening margins. Assets still appeared valuable, so they ignored rising liabilities. Lifestyle remained intact, so they dismissed structural pressure beneath it. On paper, everything seemed healthy. Underneath, flexibility was disappearing. True financial strength is not measured by how high you can climb, but by how well you can survive being wrong. I watched people survive small mistakes easily when their commitments were modest and their expenses adaptable. I watched the same people collapse under larger commitments because they had removed their margin for error. The difference was not intelligence, it was restraint. There is something unglamorous about restraint, and that is why it is often abandoned after success arrives. Yet the people who kept their wealth longest were not the most aggressive, but the most patient. They did not expand simply because they could. They did not assume the next decade would resemble the last. They structured their lives and businesses in ways that allowed for contraction without panic. They understood that protecting what you have requires the same seriousness as building it, and that quiet discipline maintained year after year matters more than bold moves that impress for a season. At 87, I no longer measure success by how large something appears from the outside, because I have watched impressive structures hollow out long before they finally fell. What stays with me is not the size of the businesses I saw rise, but the quiet moments when their owners realized they had mistaken momentum for security. That realization rarely came in public. It happened late at night, in offices after everyone else had gone home, or at kitchen tables where spouses asked questions that had been avoided for months. The loss was not just financial, it was the loss of certainty. When I say I watched successful people lose everything quietly, I do not mean they all went bankrupt or disappeared. Some simply stepped down under pressure. Some sold at valuations far below what they once believed they were worth. Some spent years rebuilding what could have been preserved. What they shared was not stupidity or bad luck, but a slow drift away from caution once success made them comfortable. If there is anything I would leave you with, it is this. Success is not a shield, it is a responsibility. The higher you climb, the more carefully you must move, because the fall becomes more expensive, not only in money, but in time and reputation. Protecting what you build requires humility long after the applause fades. It requires the willingness to look at numbers honestly, to question your own assumptions, and to accept that saying no is often the most profitable decision you can make. I have seen wealth created and I have seen it dissolve, and the difference was rarely dramatic. It was steady discipline on one side and steady overconfidence on the other. If you remember anything from an 87-year-old businessman, remember this. The quiet habits you maintain after you succeed will determine whether that success remains yours, or whether one day you will look back and realize it slipped away while everything still appeared fine.